G'day. In the previous video I made up some worms, and in that video I showed the whole setup for making the worms. There was a bit of a diversion for a bit of tooling as well, but in this video I foolishly said that everything was plain sailing from here on. I'm on the home stretch now. I've got everything sorted, I think, but things proceeded to go wrong. So there was a bit of recovery involved, and there are a few choices to make. And so in this video I'm not dealing so much with cutting the worms, but how you can get around some of the problems. Well, how you can either avoid some of the problems that I had, or if they do occur, what one way to recover is. This is how I do things. It's not necessarily how everybody else does them, but there's a few tips in here as to, well, okay, how can you improve your operations? So I hope it's interesting. So I've just had a crash. I've reground my tool. Now what do I do? Well, the first thing I do once I've reground the tool is I get out a diamond hone. These sort of things, the easy laps are reasonable. That's a proprietary one from somewhere, I think. But I give the tool a bit of a hone. Doesn't have to be much, just light, to make sure that my edges are sharp and I haven't got any burrs on them. Now I'm going to put in my tool holder. Now, the tool holder, I usually put the tools against the back there, and that way I can tell whether there's been any movement. And on this one, this side was kicked out. Okay. I haven't done that up tight because I don't need it up tight at the moment. Now. These things are called, well, some of them are called fishtail gauges. I guess there's a fish shape there. But they're grinding gauges primarily for, actually that's not quite true. They're gauges for tools. In this case, this is an Acme thread gauge. This one is a more general one, which is, this is a Moore and Wright, but it's got 6 degree for American and metric. It's got 55 for Whitworth and BSF. There's a BA one there, and there's an Acme one here. And if you've never seen these before, the way they're used is you hold them flat against your work, and then you're going to position your tool so it's running up the side of the gauge, and that then shows you, because these things are precision made, that then shows you that the tool is actually square to the work. Now I've had to disengage everything here because as soon as you take the tool out and you regrind it, you're going to change the relationship. So we've got to refine all that. Now the first thing I'll do is find the zero. So I just gently run my tool until it's touching on the crest of the thread, or if there's if it's a sharp pointed thread and you're right now down near the end, well, you may have to guess a little bit on that. But I can now re-zero my tool, or sorry, re-zero my slide, and know that's where my zero is. Okay. What I just did there was started the lathe up with the tool not engaged, and then applied the stop, turned the power off, while still leaving the thread feed engaged. Okay, and the reason for that is that I now need to synchronize the thread with the groove. This is one of the reasons why I like plunge cutting threads, because it gives you that adjustment. There was a bit of an argument between plunge cutting and mounting the cross slide at a little bit less than half the thread angle and coming in. Now the people who set their cross sides over on an angle, the main reason is that one side of the tool is doing the cutting The other side is just sitting there. Okay, and so you set it equal to or a little bit less than the angle, so that face is not doing terribly much. I started learning that way. I prefer plunge cutting now just because it's a lot simpler. And when you think about it, when you start to do nuts for lead screws or for anything really, cutting internal threads, you're going to have to plunge cut. Right? In that case, the cut is out, not in. Back to this. I've now got my tool. I've got my tool squared to the axis of the work. I've got my tool synchronized. I'm now going to start up, and I'm just going to go back to the start and engage my tool and just check that I've got that right, because nothing ruins a job faster when you're this far along than not having it quite set up right. So I'm going to check that, and then I can, shall we say, gingerly take up thread cutting where I was. Yeah, it's one of those things. I've just done the same thing again to check my thread engagement, and it looks good. It's sitting where it should be. I can wind that in and I won't get one side touching before the other side. So I think I'm pretty much good to go there. One thing I will do when cutting a thread like this, particularly a flat top thread, is every so often I'll just run the file across. Not very often, but just every so often, because particularly with using a flat top tool like this, you tend to get the corners burring up a little bit, which means if you're trying to measure diameters and that sort of thing, you run into strife. Which brings me to another point too. One of the mistakes that I first made when I started cutting threads was that I took my material to the OD of my thread, and then I proceeded to cut the thread, and I wondered why I had a lot of trouble fitting. When you look at diagrams of threads in thread tables and things, they'll show you that the tips of the threads are truncated. And so generally, if you're around about 1/10 of the pitch under size, it won't hurt the thread, but it'll make it go on a lot more easily. So when starting out, if I'm cutting, say, a thread in a bit of 25 bar stock or something like that with a say a 2mm pitch or that sort of thing, I might set that up as 24.9 as the OD, so I can then come in and do that, and I'll get a much better thread, or much nicer fitting thread because of it. One of the problems with fitting threads, of course, is that you're never quite sure whether you've taken enough material off the flanks or whether it's the top binding or it's the bottom of binding. So you need to set your tool up so that you're going to the right depth, and you need to make sure your OD isn't too great. So yeah, check it with a micrometer if you're not sure whether you need to take a burr off, but that's another tip. This is a handy trick to know. Normally when you're drilling a hole, the pilot drill only needs to be around about the size of the chisel point on the drill. So, you know, a pilot hole for this would be probably 3-4 millimeters. This is a 5/16. However, if you drill that out nearly to size and then you run a drill bit through, this will act as basically as a poor man's ream. Normally you'd ream a hole to get it precise to size and also get a good surface finish on it. Now, if the surface finish doesn't worry you quite so much because you're not running on it as a bearing or something, you just need it sized, sometimes you can get away with running through a drill, your final size drill, after you've taken the majority of material out. And I'm guessing the reason this works, I don't know for certain, but is that what you're doing is you're not getting the tip of the drill involved, you're just getting the very corners of the grind. Now, of course, that means you have to have a sharp drill, but it also means that because you're not involving the tip, the drill isn't wandering around the place and causing things to go oversize. So it's a handy tip that if you want a hole which is sized pretty close to you know, whatever it is you're wanting, using a drill as a final ream is not too bad. This is a .313 pin gauge, and so that's 5/16 more or less, and that's only just going on. So that's a pretty good size for size fit there. One potential reason for the tool that I had being able to spoil so easily was that typically for a threading tool I only need a narrow tip, and so I'll cut that away with an angle grinder or grind that away. Now if you overheat that can lead to micro cracking, I'm told, and that might be certainly a contributing factor. So this is one option for threading tools: grind down a piece of tool steel, and you want to have a reasonable depth there so that you get some strength in the tip, which means of course you have to have a reasonable width. The other option is this. This is a holder I made up, but it's based on something that I saw when I was many years younger, and it's basically a holder which enables you to hold a small piece of tool steel. In this case, this is a bit of 3/16, I think, which is just under 5mm. That's certainly plenty wide enough to produce a cutting tip. It holds it so that it's pretty well supported right up to the tip, but it means that I can now use a smaller piece or smaller size piece of tool steel, grind my tip on it, and still have that support. So that's a possibility too. If you're finding, particularly with fine threads, that you're having to grind away a lot of tool steel, you might want to consider making up something like this. Another thing worth noting when doing threading operations is your running speed. Now, Carbide typically requires anywhere from about 3 up to 7 times the speed you'd run a high-speed steel at. And so there are times when, if I have to slow down because of chatter, I'll actually switch to a high-speed steel tool simply because it's running closer to its optimal conditions. You can get Carbide thread inserts and they can be used, but they are designed primarily for CNC lathes where they can run flat out and cut a thread at 2000 RPM. So threading speeds you can work out using the same methods as I used in the Need for Non-Speed video. The only difference is that instead of the diameter of the cutting tip, when talking about a lathe, you're talking about the diameter of the work that it's cutting on. Just because you can get a Carbide threading tip doesn't necessarily mean that on a manual lathe it's necessarily a good idea. There are people out there who swear by them, but it's one of those things that I'd approach with caution, because you need to slow down. I'll start at around 80 RPM as my go-to threading speed, and then go up and go down depending on how close I have to get to the chuck, how fine the thread is, and all that sort of thing. If it's a very fine thread, you can go a bit faster because it gives you a little bit more response time when you have to stop. But if it's a very coarse thread, then you're going to have to slow down, so you've got enough time to be able to get to the end of the cut and say, right, stop, pull out. It helps when cutting threads, particularly deep ones like this, to use some form of lubricant. This is just neat cutting oil. I've never quite got round to plumbing lubricant into my lathe, so I just apply it with a brush. These are a little thing I picked up from Tom Lipton at Ox Tools, but they're actually a paint pot designed for, or they're sold as, designed for kids. There are no spill arrangements, so provided you keep the oil level down, you can sort of have them tipped on their side or even upside down, and the oil won't spill out, which is not a bad feature. I hope these tips will be helpful next time the worms of doom, or whoever your nemesis are, come calling, and we'll see you next time.